Okay, welcome, Philosophy of Biology class. I'm here with Robin Andreasen, professor at the University of Delaware. Welcome, Robin.
Hi, class.
So, Robin, we have read your 1998 paper, A New Perspective on the Race Debate. So I was hoping that we could talk about that paper and try to understand what's in it, and then maybe address some objections to and see maybe if you've changed over the last I guess 22 years is a long time ago. so um, you say there, you in another paper, you call that a cladistic race concept or something like that. Could you say a little bit about what that means? I mean, what is cladism and how does that apply here?
Okay, so the paper, just to give you a little bit of background, at the time I wrote the paper, I had seen the Richard Lewontin piece on why there were no races, and that sort of sparked my interest because it seemed curious to me. And I started to do some sort of research on how he was thinking about race in that particular paper. And being a philosophy of biology student with Elliot Sober, I was obviously well trained in sort of evolutionary theory. And it struck me that Lewontin was using a similarity-based measure of classification, which is something that people do when you think about how you classify social categories, natural categories, biological categories. Similarity can be an important variable. But of course, in biology, only if you're doing evolutionary biology, certain types of similarities are more informative than others if you're trying to understand ancestry, right? And those are going to be the sort of ones that are going to be less due to exposure to similar environments. And so you think that the reason is not because they were independently adapted in two different places because they were similar environments, but because they were inherited. Um, and so that got me thinking about race and how I was working with some biologists too at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it was pretty much a given amongst most people that race is a dead concept, and you shouldn't use it. But then I started thinking, well, how do we classify in biology in general? And in general, biology uses these sort of more phylogenetic classification schemes. Cladism has some specific sort of technical aspects to it, which I wasn't meaning to capture when I referred to this as a cladistic account. I was just trying to get the idea across that if you can have a branching structure, then you can use the cut method that I describe in the paper, which is really just Eliot's idea. And of course, it's brilliant because it's Eliot. Um, and you can then anything above that cut constitutes a legitimate grouping from a biological point of view. And so then you can say that this group is more similar to another group than it is to a third group. So that got me thinking that that is something that is a race concept because it's a measure of something going on that's biologically meaningful below the species level.
Okay, so yeah, you sort of start your paper by saying that if race is kind of a biologically valuable category, then it's basically going to be equivalent to subspecies. Is that so? It's just race. You just mean kind of any grouping that's biologically real that's below the species level. That's all you mean by subspecies, right?
Exactly. And so like if you think about, and I don't know how much of this other research your students have read or you have read, but if you think about like what Dobzhansky was doing or some of these other evolutionary biologists, sort of more historically, the subspecies concept was being used a little bit differently. So the point I make almost applies to non-humans as much as it applies to humans, which is if we're going to have a concept about what's going on below the species level, a really good candidate is to be thinking more phylogenetically than do less of this sort of similarity-based classifications.
Yeah. So, right in the paper, you say, well, this kind of typological concept doesn't really work, and the geographical concept doesn't really work, but the cladistic one does, which I believe your definition is something like, so there's a breeding population and all of its descendants or collections of such populations.
Right.
So that's what races are. And I guess the idea would be something like, if there are races in humans, that's what they would be.
Right.
Is that the right?
Yeah, and then I would just make it even a little more refined by saying, if there are biologically meaningful racial groups, I believe that there are social races too, and they're not necessarily the same thing. And as a matter of fact, I don't think they are the same thing. I think science is again and again bearing out that when you use the race concept in biology, you're often doing something that's different. It's overlapping. It's not a complete divergence. But, and I think there, you know, over time, like this is where, again, Quaishon's stuff comes in. Quaishon thinks there's much more overlap. And over time, so that tree that's in the paper is from 19 whatever. And of course, that's not the going tree. That was just an example to get people thinking about how this would look and to make the conceptual point that there may be some mismatching. Now, the mismatching has gotten, over time, the going view, people like Noah Rosenberg, who's a population biologist at Stanford, although I think he's still at Stanford, but anyway.
He's still there, yeah.
Yeah. His results are starting to match more closely to our everyday racial groupings. So then you might not have much divergence.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's separate these questions into, you know, what is the history of humans actually, you know, what is that tree? What does it mean? How to read it? And then we'll talk about what that means for race. So first, you know, you present this tree. So I'm going to share my screen with you and show you the tree from your paper so that we can try to understand it. Here's this tree you have. This is figure 3. You can see that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So the clades, following the cut method, as you say, just sort of pick a point and then all of the descendants. So time goes to the right here. So all the things. So for example, you know, here's a clade, the top 3 groups, the New Guinean and Australian, Pacific Islander, and Southeast Asian. That's one clade.
Exactly.
But for example, Southeast Asian and Northeast Asian, they don't go together unless you have all of the groups except for African.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just imagine, so there's some population history of humans. I mean, there's got to be some history.
Right.
You know, geography alone is going to keep people separated for long periods of time. Certainly in the past, there was. So there's questions about what the proper tree looks like, but let's assume that it's this one. So now what is this, you know, so how many clades are there? Well, there's lots, and they're overlapping. So what is the cladistic view of race then? Which ones are races?
Okay, so you would take any of these ones on the end could be considered their own race, right? So each one that's named is a race. But then I say that conceptually it makes sense to have a sort of nested hierarchy of racial categories, and which level of analysis you were interested in would really depend on what you're doing, right? Like, so, but like one thing that's been ridiculously consistent throughout all the literature is the Africa piece. It's very clear that things started in Africa, and then there were these waves of migration out of Africa. And so you notice that they're off on the side. That represents their sort of the most historically original group, for lack of a better word. But then, you know, it makes sense. Like sometimes you may want to look at things in a more coarse-grained analysis, and sometimes you may want a more refined analysis, depending on sort of what your research question is.
So really, you think sort of any of these monophyletic groups can count as a race to a biologist?
Yes.
That seems a little bit strange to me. If you have, let's say you have a tree of you know, species or something like that, there's going to be, you know, if I say, am I the same species as you or not? You know, the biologist would say, well, that's a question. There might be weird hard cases that are kind of vague, but what we're we can build the tree, and then on top of that, we have facts about species. But here, so if I say something like, am I the same race as this person whose ancestry is from India, for example? So if we look at that tree, so I'm in the, now I'm going to have to open the tree again because I canceled it. But okay, so much of my ancestry, probably not all, I'll definitely want to ask you about interbreeding, but much of my ancestry is going to be European, but not, if they're from the Indian subcontinent, it's going to be non-European Caucasoid. So on one way of carving it up, we're different groups, and on another way of carving it up, we're the same.
Right.
So there's just no fact about whether we're the same race, or how do you read that?
Well, I guess you have to remember that when you construct this tree in the first place, you're starting with breeding populations. Mm-hmm. So you've got these sort of bracket categories. You've got the species level and you've got the breeding population. And then you've got these groups in between. And it's not that easy to get branching. I mean, if you read this literature, you see, especially back when I was writing this paper, there were more people saying, there's no way we can have a race concept at all because there's too much interbreeding, mm-hmm. right? And so, because of course, to get the branching, you need to have reproductive isolation over, tens of thousands of years, if not a whole lot more, mm-hmm. right? And so that's part of the debate. Has there been enough isolation among these populations for these to even count as races? So I don't think it's a super risk because it's not going to explode into too many little subgroupings. Mm-hmm. I think it does in a way reflect how we think about race, even in our everyday thinking, because like when I teach a race gender science class, and when we get to the race section, I just do a stupid, or not stupid, I shouldn't call it stupid, but I do this exercise where, we just do a word cloud as a class to get people thinking about what is a race on their view. And of course, you have exactly this outcome where like people want to dial it down more or make it a little bit broader, right? And you even see that in the history of the US Census. You have these periods where we have like 2 racial categories and then there's 15. And so, yeah, there is sort of a question about whether there should be a right answer, but it's not an anything goes situation at all because of this branching situation.
Right.
And the other thing is, that's where, I have this very sort of pragmatic way of thinking about classification, which is if it's theoretically useful, mm-hmm. and which is that's not an easy condition to meet, especially when you're talking about race and biology. And if it's, then it's contextual. Then it's like, again, back to this, what's your question? So if you're looking at something like a particular disease where it may be relevant to have it more broken down, mm-hmm. then you should go that route. But there may be other contexts where if you're trying to map that onto, say, our social world, where you're trying to relate social causes of a disease, like, take something like asthma. How does that map? We're going to have coarser categories because in our social world, when we discriminate against each other, yeah. those categories are broader.
Yeah, so one thing that I think would be really important for students to understand, so I'll mention it now. You say that not anything goes. So here's an example of something. So maybe it's an open question whether I'm the same race as this person from the Indian subcontinent. But what you can't do is cross the monophyletic group. So for example, you can't put Indians with other Southeast Asians. At least if your tree is the correct tree. Right. And then here's a harder one. You can't put the Southeast Asians with the Northeast Asians unless you include, huge clusters of people. So, we can get these very sort of, I think, surprising results. So for example, I guess Southeast Asia includes like Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, but not, for example, China or Japan. So in the US Census, I'm pretty confident those things, they would be classified together as
right.
Asian.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the US Census categories are starting to map fairly well to what Out of Africa is saying. With the Rosenberg results. And that's something I point out in a subsequent paper that I've written, that like it's actually, if you look at the census categories, it's actually a little weird because they're actually defined in terms of ancestry. If your ancestors hail from this part of the world in the evolutionary distant past, it's very close to getting to one of these phylogenetic branching concepts of race.
Okay. So you had said before that you think, well, there's this other thing, a social conception of race. So maybe in the United States, we have a conception that puts, let's say, Southeast Asians with Northeast Asians together. So is that objectively real and race, and the biological thing is also race? Is it a pluralism?
It's for sure a pluralism.
It's for sure a pluralism. So
my view.
One paper that we read last week, Anthony Appiah, Why There's No Human Races, he says that race is meant to be a scientific category. There's experts, there's semantic deference. So maybe ordinary people might mean a certain thing by race, but Appiah would say, if scientists disagree, then ordinary people are just wrong. So why not say that? Why not say, it turns out we're just wrong? Many Americans would lump, Southeast Asians with Northeast Asians, but they're wrong.
Okay, because, on my opinion, but I don't always think I'm right, but I do think I'm right about this one. Our social race categories so the concept of realism that I'm working with, and this is something I don't think comes through as well as it could have in that paper, because I use the expression natural kinds, and I think that is way too loaded of a term, and it suggests a level of objectivity that has an essentialist ring to it, even though I'm careful to say that this is not an essentialist concept. But I use a weaker concept of realism, which is much closer to just theoretical utility or projectability or something in that domain. And so I feel like the use of the word race in our social world is so clearly theoretically useful and projectable. It explains why, unfortunately right now, certain people are being discriminated against based on the history of the coronavirus. It explains why some people have access to certain resources more than other people, by something that's more than just quote unquote class, right? That, our history of racism in our country means that people who are African American, that is an experience that is different, that they have, it's a legacy, and so I understand his temptation there, but I also think Ron Mallon, I almost gave this paper to you when you asked for recommendations, but I didn't. Ron has a paper where he basically says that these semantic arguments are kind of doomed to failure, because anytime you put a stake in the ground, you've got a theoretical assumption that you're working with. And then, so Appiah has an assumption. I actually adopted that in my paper, but went a different direction with it. But somebody like Glasgow, he uses a descriptive theory, right? So when Glasgow and I, because I know you're reading the Glasgow paper, when we disagree, part of what's going on there is we're using two different kinds of concepts of how you ground a term. So the reason I gave you the Sally Haslinger paper instead was because I think Sally and Ron and some other people have made an excellent point, which is maybe we should really be thinking about normative type things, like what's going to be the right concept for what we need to do with these terms.
So you mentioned theoretical utility. So it seems clear. I mean, I agree that the social concept of race, it's pretty powerful. Social scientists need to know that in the United States, these people are going to be treated the same way. But now, why is your concept that useful? I mean, maybe this goes the other way. Maybe this shows that actually it's the biological one that doesn't really match race and is not really useful at all. So sure, we can detect ancestry, but at least, for example, I know the Rosenberg 2002 paper, the way he does that, they're mostly looking at neutral alleles. They basically don't do anything of importance. Their groups don't even match, for example, skin color. So why not, what use is this? So it's true, you can find, where on the earth your ancestors came from, but that's not important. Why does that matter at all?
Excellent question. But I do think it's important. I would agree that the social science concept in this day and age is more robust. It has more legs, theoretically. But the biological concept is being utilized. This is where the race and medicine papers come into play. The biological concept is being utilized in looking at the genetic basis of disease. Mm-hmm. It's being utilized for the purpose of, this is a concept that, Joel, you will understand, and I don't know what level your students are at, but if they don't know a lot of population biology, mm-hmm. they may not understand, but it's, they use it to control for population stratification, right? So that when you're doing a, say, cohort study, and you're saying, we're gonna do cases versus controls, you wanna make sure that these people are from the same sort of ancestral background so that you're not actually pulling ancestry when you notice that there's a set of alleles that are more common in this group than in this group. Mm-hmm. So I spent quite a bit of time the last several summers reading many, many articles on this stuff. And I came to the very strong conclusion that it actually, people are scared to use the word race for good reasons, like for very good reasons, when they do science. And so sometimes they flip to ethnicity, but that doesn't really fix the problems, because whatever the ethical issues are with using the word race are going to occur with ethnicity too. Yeah. And sometimes they try to use population or ancestry, but then it gets read in terms of race because the categories are the ones that come out of these mm-hmm. branching theories. So, but there's definitely a good amount of research. And if anything, I mean, one thing that's kind of interesting to me is even the people who are real social constructionists about race, who think there's nothing biological about it ever under any possible interpretation, are having to start to admit that the genetic correlations are becoming actually more robust over time as we get more and more sort of big data analysis going on.
Yeah. So to ask about like race and medicine. So what if I say that, look, there's just so much interbreeding now, and there's so much, there's statistical variation within races and things. If I say, I'm a doctor, I'm going to treat, you this way because you look Asian. Well, that's a disaster. That's obviously not a good idea. Right. So how could it be useful? And what if, if I said, the studies that are coming out about ancestry often are like this. Well, this particular population has, 60% frequency of this allele and 72% of this allele and 12% of this allele and 18% of this allele. And then now you get like Edward's point that you mentioned before, that if I have enough of those and I have, say, your profile, I can pin with high accuracy which of those things you come from. That doesn't mean that I can actually predict what your genome is. So if I know your ancestry, I don't know anything about what you're like.
Right.
So on the face of it, it might seem like using race in medicine, maybe if you're very careful and you know exactly what you're doing and you just look at, say, genetics, you can do that. But why is that looking at race? And why is that just not so dangerous and so prone to error that it's not going to work out?
Okay, yeah, those are lots of questions, and they're all excellent ones. Those are the ones that
will ask them, I'm sure.
What's that?
Well, students have already asked some of these questions about, just when I talk to them, they say, racism in medicine isn't going to work. What does my doctor think I am? Because they're mixed or something.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, you have to start with a very simple distinction, which is using it in the clinic versus using it in research. Mm-hmm. I don't advocate for it in the clinic at all. I think medicine is such that you're often making quick decisions and you don't have the time to do the careful thinking that would be required to use it in the clinic. So that's piece one. So like, but when people who are doing biomedical research and are trying to understand something like asthma, they have found these people report that the people who are actually doing the research report that they find the variable theoretically useful in these ways. And so a lot of these people happen to be at Stanford, but which is good in that sense, but bad because maybe if they're all coming from the same place, they've created their own little mini culture that could be suspicious. But I think after having, like I said, read enough about it, I feel like it's useful for understanding the genetic origins of certain diseases under certain contexts. And it's not a whole lot of diseases, but it is some. And then there's the other point, which I have made in one of my papers, is so many diseases are a result of gene environment interaction. So here we have a situation, it's a real popular view in the literature that the social race concept in medicine needs to be retained because we're just seeing this right now, coronavirus. We're starting to see differences in exposure and response to if you're infected, how people are progressing with the disease by race. That's just been in the media very recently. Okay, well, very, very reasonable question at that point is, what's going on here? Why? Well, you know that a huge chunk of it is social, right? It's like maybe if there's a correlation between socioeconomic status and race, and that explains that those people maybe are the ones that are delivering groceries for people and therefore risking, more on the front lines than those of us who are university professors who get to Zoom from home and get a paycheck.
That's right.
So there's that. But then now let's go away from coronavirus and let's go to diseases that are known to have a genetic component like asthma. Well, how are you going to study, if you want to study the sort of interaction between these social factors and the genes, well, then you're going to need to use the same category in the social piece as in the genetic piece. And so even if you wanted to sort of say, oh, there's very few things that are meaningful at the genetic level, and therefore we don't really need it. It's not theoretically interesting enough to keep it because of all the risks. You still have this problem, which is this interaction. There's so many of these diseases that are genetic and social, and you're gonna need to keep the category for studying both sides.
I see. So you think, so something like eliminativism just doesn't make sense.
Right.
It's scientifically useful, but if we keep a race concept, now we have this problem that sometimes it refers to these social categories and sometimes to ancestry. So what if I just say we should make up, two new words? Neither one of them should be race, and they should, some kind of pluralism thing. Or is race, is it really the same thing? I thought maybe you said that it's somehow, the category somehow involves both ancestry and something else.
They may be different things, but if they correlate well enough, you could use the same sort of classification scheme to look at the interactions between the two variables. But the other problem is race is so entrenched in our vocabulary that, this I completely flagrantly borrowed from Mark Arashevsky and his view about species. Because, people do the same arguments with species that we should eliminate the term because it's problematic in all these ways. And he's just like, yeah, go look at all these textbooks, let's really be, so yeah, maybe in a perfect world, but the paper, the conceptual fragmentation paper that I gave you, there I end up arguing at the very end that it's almost, if you're going to try to eliminate the word race from the biological context, I think it really just needs to be eliminated from all contexts. And so the position I go to there is kind of, it's a little bit more neutral of a position about eliminativism. What I say is, if you're going to be an eliminativist about race, you shouldn't do it selectively just for biology. You should do it full across the board. But that presents, like, think about trying to eliminate the social race concept. Even if you're not worried about entrenchment, race has, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Taylor has a really nice paper about the value of racial classification schemes. People may not really, you know, you could do this with gender too. You could do it with all sorts of things. Like, is gender the problem, or is it that we've loaded gender in ways that we shouldn't have, with our normative attachments being sort of biased in various ways?
Yeah. Well, that might be a good place to end, but I want to ask you about one more thing. So you say in your paper, maybe this tree is evidence that races used to exist, but they might be on their way out. So what do you mean by that? You just mean something like, look, levels of interbreeding between these different populations are high enough. But many, I mean, my students seem to think, well, then they would already be gone. But the fact is, we can still build these trees. So are those trees just between these, you know, kind of native populations, or could we do the same thing with, you know, with all of us? I mean, and when you say it's on your way out, I mean, do you mean like in a generation, or do you mean like in 10,000 years? I mean, what's the future of race?
Okay, so when I wrote that paper, my thought was races once existed, they may be on their way out. What I really was trying to say is that I wanted to give credit to those people who maybe say that there are no biological races today. So partly what I was doing in that paper was just trying to make a conceptual point about constructionism, because constructionism gets a little lost within itself. And so I wanted to make the conceptual point that, first of all, biological categories are not eternal the way they think they are. Like, the way they think about biology is all upside down. And so they don't think about biology the way scientists think about biology, and that struck me as odd. So that was a conceptual point. So one reason to say races may have once existed is to make that conceptual point. Now, when I wrote the paper, I considered it highly likely that today there are no races on a biological level. But that was also in 1998, when this sort of science was just sort of in an early stage. As the science has advanced, I've come to conclude that there is some biological, like, I don't want to say that race, I don't anymore want to say race is biological. I want to say our everyday racial categories do sometimes correlate with something that's going on at the biological level that people care about. And then I want to make a real important theoretical point about the ethics of all this. Like, the ethics, I fully agree that we need to worry about racism a lot. And we only, as time goes on, it becomes more and more evident that people can be horribly racist in both overt and very subtle ways. But on the other hand, I've thought and thought and thought about, like, how do you address this problem? Like, what do you do about that? And that's where things get really difficult, because we're sexist, but we don't get rid of gender in medicine, you know? And so we've got to think about these things in an apples versus apples sort of way. I guess that was a rambling answer to your question, because to tell you the truth, I've even forgotten what the question was.
Well, it was just about what the future of race is. So it was super open-ended. There's lots of things to say.
I guess I think that it's not clear to me. I think that I actually don't think there's biological races the way I did in that original paper. I think now that social constructionists don't think well about scientific categories and make all sorts of conceptual errors that they shouldn't be allowed to make. And I think that racial categories do have some theoretically valuable aspects within the context of biology. Those things I would say. Not a huge amount, but I feel like, yeah, you either throw the whole thing out, social and biological, or you figure out a way to deal with this. And the other paper I gave you, which is the one that's going to go in biology and philosophy, there I sort of talk about how we spend too much time focusing on linguistic solutions to this problem, when maybe really we need to get serious about putting our money behind like really addressing the actual racism that is perpetuating the problem in the first place. Because those are social things that we want a nice clean fix, right? We just want to be able to change our words and then it's all fixed. That's not realistic.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Robin. I know I enjoyed our discussion and I learned a lot. I'm sure the students did too. So
Joel, I appreciate this. This was wonderful for me. I don't do this ever, really, so it was nice.
Well, you should do it more. So,
well, thank you.
So thank you very much. And I'm going to say goodbye.
All right. Goodbye.